We'll see if it works. It's on. Steph. I don't know why it was. Okay. Tonight, we are going to note the italic. Very brief. It's not going to feel brief, but very brief primer on apologetics as it relates to the New Testament text. Apologetics, for those who are not aware, or maybe you forgot, apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which we find in 1 Peter 3:15. Be ready to make a defense. This idea of defense, that's where we're getting this word apologetics. Very brief primer on the defense of the text of the New Testament, specifically. For, inasmuch as many of us compile a narrative and accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, this is Luke, having followed all things closely for time past. Theophilus, whoa, I guess you switched me back over to this mic, huh, Tristan? Yeah, I could hear it cutting in and out, too. I don't know what the deal is with this mic. Theophilus, we don't really know who that is. Friend of Luke, some guy that Luke knew, that Luke has apparently been in contact with, and basically Luke is saying, look, you've heard a lot about this Jesus guy. You've heard a lot about what's been going on with this Christianity, the movement of the disciples. Maybe he called it the way. There's a number of different names in the New Testament. But basically, Luke is writing his gospel so that Theophilus can have certainty. Look, you've heard a lot of stuff. Let me set the record straight for you. This is what happened. I've investigated it for some time past. And so as we're thinking about the Gospels, Luke is addressing the question, how can we be certain the Gospels are true? How can we be certain that they are reliable as a document for us to understand? This is especially difficult for modern readers compared to the original audience. In the original, you had people around who lived the events. You could just go ask them, hey, there's Peter, there's Paul, there's Luke is present for some of the stuff in Acts. Like, there's a bunch of people, and of course, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus appeared to the disciples and the apostles, and then 500 people. He appeared to 500 people at one time. So there's a bunch of people around. If you're alive in the first century, just go talk to that guy. Talk to these people who saw it. And of course, all of the apostles are still there, so you're seeing this miraculous confirming power. You have the great miracles that they're doing as a confirmation of the message that they're preaching. And so the further we get from the events described, the more complicated the question of reliability becomes. And at this point, 2,000 years later, we're really at a different way of thinking about sort of the accuracy or the reliability of the text than anybody in the first century or second or third centuries really would have been thinking. While this is, again, a very broad and brief lesson, I want tonight to go over very basic in broad strokes the arguments for the reliability of the gospel text. And fundamentally, it comes down to two different ways of thinking about it. One, we have arguments based on history and how we know it, and two, arguments based on psychology and what we know about human nature. Now, we're stepping one level back. I will say, if you want to know more, please come talk to me. But as we think about the arguments of the text of Scripture, the reliability of the text, you might notice, if you're familiar with apologetics, that we are skipping over sort of the first main branch of apologetics, which is the existence of God. We're going to talk about that briefly as we go through the sermon. But primarily what I'm concerned with tonight is the reliability of the text itself. And that really comes down to two different branches, history and psychology. First, we think about arguments based on history and how we know it at all. You think about the question, how do we know what happened in the past? This is just a generic question that humans have to grapple with. How can we have any confidence at all about anything that happened in the past? This is covered by, when thinking about the biblical text, covered by the study of textual criticism. Do we have the right text? Is the text that we have, the Bibles that we have, is that what they wrote? Is the first question. The collection and analysis of ancient manuscripts endeavors to answer this question. Do we have the text that was originally written? Now, we should say right off the bat, we don't have a single autograph. When I say autograph, I mean the original document that Paul literally touched and literally wrote down. We don't have any of those. We don't have any of the original autographs, things that they actually wrote, the physical paper that the apostles handled. We don't have any of those, but we do have around 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, the earliest with which dates to the late 1st century. Now, that should be late 2nd century. That's a typo. Late 2nd century. You think that's not very, like we only have manuscripts and these are parts of the documents in late 2nd century. That doesn't seem like it's very reliable. We have 10,000 more manuscripts from 200 to 700 AD in primarily Latin, but a couple other languages, but primarily languages like Latin. And if that doesn't seem very much to you, the second most attested ancient document is the Iliad. Okay, the Iliad is, it's a epic poem. We have 600 pieces of evidence for the text. That's it, 600. That is the second most well-attested ancient document, 600. And nobody really cares. Like, the Iliad is a great poem, I guess, but nobody really cares if we have the text right. But historians are not arguing, are we sure we have the right text of the Iliad? 600, they're pretty confident. Like, yeah, we have the text. We have 600 documents, 600 pieces of evidence. We're pretty confident that we've reconstructed the Iliad as it was written. Of course, what we have for the New Testament is orders of magnitude greater, right? 1,600 manuscripts versus 600. And again, nobody really argues about the text of the Iliad, not because it's an open historical question, but because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the text of the Iliad is, unless you're a really hardcore historian and you want to know the answer. For most people, it just doesn't matter. The text of the New Testament is up for dispute, not because the evidence isn't there, but because it's a demanding text. And if it's true, if what we have is accurate, it expects quite a bit more of you than the Iliad. And I should note, the earliest we have of the Iliad, the earliest piece of evidence, is 500 years later than the original. So not only do we have way more evidence in volume, we also have better evidence for the text of the New Testament in chronology. That is, we have earlier evidence of the text of the New Testament. We can reconstruct all but 11 verses of the New Testament by quotes in the 2nd and 3rd centuries by the ancient church fathers, early church fathers is what I should say. If you just rebuild what they wrote, you just take the early church fathers, Ignatius, Polycarp, Augustine, 2nd and 3rd centuries, you can reconstruct everything but 11 verses of the New Testament just from their quotes. That's not documents that are purported to be the actual New Testament, just their writing, and they say, as so-and-so, as Paul says in this book, or as Jesus says in this book, and you can reconstruct almost the entire New Testament. While there is some debate about the wording of specific verses, you will notice in your English Bibles a couple of places. There are the double, I can't really do the square brackets with my hands, but the double square brackets, you'll notice a couple of places in the New Testament, John chapter 8, Mark chapter 16, where they have the sort of double square brackets, and there's some debate about the wording of those specific verses, but there's nothing that is uncertain that isn't also addressed in other places in the Bible. For example, Mark chapter 16. There's some debate about do we have the wording exactly right. We also have Matthew 28, which is not under dispute, not under discussion. We're very confident of the text of Matthew 28, and it is a parallel to Mark chapter 16, the Great Commission. So most of the places, actually I would say all of the places, where we have this sort of debate about the validity or the wording of the text, there are parallels or there are other places in the Bible that address the same topics. And so the doctrine of those places is not up for dispute. The doctrine is not up for debate. So that's the reliability, or do we have the actual text? But is the text accurate, of course, is a different discussion. For this, we turn to a broader discussion of history. How do we know anything about history at all? Well, there's basically only two things. One is archaeological evidence, and when you think about archaeological, think of stuff and things, objects that we find. Either could be, the classic example is pottery. I don't know why I always think of, I do know why we always think of pottery, because it's clay and it lasts a while. Think about weapons or physical objects that we find, buildings, things of that nature. And the other is written evidence, written testimony, either eyewitness testimony, secondhand accounts. Of course, for a lot of historical events, we don't have eyewitness or secondhand. We're thinking third or fourth or fifth hand evidence. Some guy wrote about a thing that he heard about one time. And for a lot of our historical knowledge, that's what we're relying on. We're relying on a guy wrote about a thing that he heard about from somebody that he heard about from somebody. For the New Testament, do we have eyewitness accounts? Yeah. The writers claim to be eyewitnesses. The manuscript evidence supports such an early date of writing. It is almost unheard of in ancient history to have this much firsthand evidence, firsthand testimony of any historical event at all. It is unprecedented in historical study. What about secondhand accounts? How removed are they from the events they describe? Yeah, many New Testament writers, Luke is one of them, purport to be secondhand witnesses. That is, they talk to people who were actually there. We can think about those early church fathers again. In the early 2nd century especially, the early church fathers that were writing in the early hundreds, they knew a bunch of people who had been. Now, by the time Ignatius and Polycarp are writing, probably those 500 people that Jesus appeared to, they're probably all dead. But they know their children. They know the people that they taught. So even if we're secondhand, thirdhand at this point, we're still within 70 years of the events, 70 to 80 years of the events, which again, from the perspective of historical academia, is just unprecedented to have this wealth of knowledge. Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp quote 25 of 27 New Testament books between 95 and 115. We can just automatically assume, yeah, those books were written before 95. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc. were written before 95. And again, thinking about, okay, Jesus dies in 30 to 33, depending on what calendar you use. Let's say 30, because it makes the numbers easier. 30, say he dies in 30, 95, they're quoting these books in 95. So automatically we're 65 years out, which is still within the lifetimes of many of those people. But we can, of course, assume they're quoting it, which means it had to have been written earlier than that. So even, let's say, 50 years. How reliable is it to know things that happened 50 years ago? Like, think about 50 years ago in our context. That is, what is that, 1975? I just made a lot of you feel a lot older by saying that. How reliable do you think we know stuff that happened in 1975? It's not that difficult, right? To know things from that long ago. Now, of course, the amount of writing that we have is exponentially greater. And I would say that that's true for the vast majority of ancient events. A lot of people weren't writing. The life of Jesus is not one of those events. The life of Jesus is pretty much the only ancient event that we have an amount of writing about comparable to events today, where people wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote about these events, even non-Christian sources. So 30 to 60 year gap between the death of Jesus to the writing of the earliest New Testament books is very well within the range of historical certainty. What about non-Christian sources? 10 non-Christian writers mention Jesus within 150 years of his death. So at this point, we're extending the date out quite a bit longer, but 150 years, still not that long. Guess what? We only have 9 non-Christian writers who mention Tiberius Caesar, who is the Roman emperor of Jesus' lifetime. We have more non-Christian sources who talk about Jesus than talk about the Roman emperor at the time of the events that we're describing. From those non-Christian sources, this is historians who do not believe. These writers do not claim to believe in Jesus. They don't claim to follow him. They're just talking about, hey, this is an interesting thing that happened in this area of the world. And they're writing about it because Christianity is spreading far and wide, and it's spreading super rapidly, and people are converting. And these historians are like, what is going on? Why is everybody converting to this? What happened in Judea 100 years ago? What happened? And so this is what we know from them. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He was a virtuous person. He was a wonder worker. Now, again, these non-Christian sources have varying degrees of whether they accept the wonders that he did or not. But a lot of them, of course, believed in either the Greco-Roman gods or other gods. So, for them, it's not like, yeah, he was a wonder worker. People do that. They assumed that was a possibility, even if they don't believe he's the Son of God. He had a brother named James. He claimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. Darkness and earthquake occurred around the time of his death. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. And of course, these non-Christian sources, they're not going to claim that he rose from the dead, but they do say, yeah, his disciples, they all say he rose from the dead. His disciples willingly died for their belief. Christianity spread quickly as far as Rome, and his disciples worshiped him and denied the Roman gods. Again, this is from non-Christian sources. This is just regular secular historians who are writing about these events. And of course, we can see the reconstruction of what we find in the New Testament. This is how the events in the New Testament unfold. By the standards of historical academia, the events of the life of Jesus are the most well-documented events in the ancient world by orders of magnitude. And when it really comes down to it, if it were not for the miraculous or supernatural claims of Scripture, no one would doubt the Bible as a historical source. In fact, if it weren't for the miraculous or supernatural claims, the Bible would be, among historians, considered to be by far the most rich and valuable historical record in human history. But at that point, we're not making a historical argument. We're making a philosophical argument. A philosophical argument about whether or not you believe that the miraculous is possible. Whether or not you believe that the supernatural is possible. But that's not really, again, an argument for the validity of the text. That's a philosophical presupposition. And when it comes down to it, I said I'd mention this briefly. When you think about apologetics sort of in the more formal sense, you're making a reasoned defense of Christianity, you can't really start with the historical accuracy of the text. You really need to start with, is the supernatural possible? Is it possible for there to be things beyond the material world? Because unless a person can get to the point of accepting the supernatural, none of this is going to really matter. We'll talk about that more briefly as we go. Second, arguments based on human behavior and psychology. Okay, we can be very confident that we have the text of the New Testament as it was written, and we can be very confident that the text is at least somewhat accurate. Put yourself in the life of a first century person. Instead of thinking about it from our perspective, but it's difficult. Put yourself in the perspective, you're a 21st century person. You live in Judea, or you live in Galatia, or you live in the Mediterranean world somewhere. And you keep hearing about this guy, Jesus of Nazareth. His followers call him the Messiah. They say he was the Son of God. They say he rose from the dead. You keep hearing about this dude. And maybe an apostle comes to your town, maybe a preacher comes to your town, and you're like, this is interesting, I want to go hear this guy. And you hear what he has to say, and you believe, and you tell your friends, oh, what about this guy? Have you heard about this guy Jesus? I just heard from this guy Paul came into town, and he was preaching about this guy, and you know what? This guy Paul, he healed a bunch of people. Like, I've never even seen anything like it before in my life. This Jesus guy that he's talking about, man, we should really think deeply about this Jesus guy. And that happens over and over in town from town to town. But you can imagine how it wouldn't take very long before people start to jump on the bandwagon, not because they really believe in Jesus, but because there's this miraculous power going on. This is the exciting social movement of the day. People are being converted in droves, and you just sort of hop on the bandwagon. And you can also envision how it wouldn't take very long for people to start making up their own versions of Jesus' life. They want to get in on this train of this social movement. And then you also have the problem of, you've played the game telephone. I'm sure you've played the game telephone before. Probably been quite a while for most of us. You tell a thing, you whisper it to your friend, and then they whisper it to their friend, and then they whisper it to their friend. And by the end of that, what is said at the end is not anything like what's said at the beginning. That's probably what happens in a lot of these cases. Some guy goes to hear Paul preach. He hears about Jesus. Well, and then he goes and tells his friends, and then they go and tell their friends. And by the time you're 6 or 7 levels down, who knows how accurate what is being said is. And you're an apostle, you're a Christian, you are one of the people who were there. And you begin to hear in the circulation of these stories about Jesus, you begin to hear, well, that's not true. That's not right. I was there. That's not what he said. That's not what happened. You might be compelled to write down, this is actually how it was. This is really what happened. And I imagine that's the impetus for a lot of the New Testament writing. That's at least what I think Luke's desire is. You've heard a lot about what's been going on with Jesus. Many people have undertaken to give an account. Here's an orderly account. I went and talked to the people. This is how it actually happened. That is what the text of the New Testament in large part is. People are setting the record straight 30 to 50 years, even let's say 30 to 70 years after Jesus' ascension. Enough time has passed that people are saying false things about Jesus. We need to write down the actual thing, the thing that actually happened. And so we have incomprehensibly more evidence for the text of the New Testament than any ancient work, but again, that doesn't mean it's true. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts are at least purported to be attempts to set the record straight. This is how it actually happened. Can we trust that they're actually true? For that, we must turn to psychology. The writers were one of three things. They were either liars, they were deluded, or they were truthful. And again, I want to make very clear, there isn't another option. There's not a third option. Given the incredible external evidence for the New Testament story, the manuscript evidence for the text itself, the idea that we have some corrupted version or the thing that's not written down is just not on the table. What we have is what they wrote, which means either they were lying, they were deluded, or they were truthful. Those are kind of the only three options. We could think about the evidence that they didn't lie, and we'll go, how much time do we have? We can extend it out. We didn't have anybody who needed Lord's Supper. That gives me a few more minutes. They included embarrassing details about themselves. If you're thinking you're going to make up a story, you're just going to make up, hey, this gospel story. And again, these are being written 30 to 70 years later. A lot of stories have circulated around by now. A lot of rumors about what's been going on in Judea. And they're writing these things 30 to 70 years later to set the record straight. Hey, you're probably not going to include a bunch of stuff that makes you look like an idiot. That's what they do. They're dim-witted. Mark, we're not going to look at these references, but Mark 9:32, Luke 18:34, Jesus rebukes them often. Mark 8:33, they're cowardly. Of course, we talked about them fleeing the scene of his arrest. They're doubtful. They doubt a bunch of times. They include difficult, embarrassing, and demanding sayings of Jesus. If you're making this up sort of after the fact, you want more people to believe, you're probably not including John 6, where he says, you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And of course, in the moment in John chapter 6, he says that, and a bunch of people are like, ugh, I don't want to listen to that. Let's go away. Let's leave this guy. But they include it because, again, they really earnestly believe it to be true. They include divergent details. One of the things about a study of the gospel parallels, or the sort of a harmony of the gospels, if the gospel accounts are not contradictory, their differences reinforce the validity of the account. They didn't intentionally get together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not like they all sat down and were like, hey, let's make up this story and make sure all our versions are they line up really well. They obviously didn't do that at all. They each just wrote the thing that they believed, the thing that they remembered, and of course we would say by inspiration, the thing that the Spirit wanted them to say. But they didn't intentionally get up to sync up their stories. They included details that make no sense to invent. Having women be the ones that show up at the tomb first, not a great way to make your case in the first century. Now, maybe for us, would be fine. For them, that would really undercut the validity of the message. One of the women who was even demon-possessed. Luke 8:2, we see that. Many of these claims could have been fact-checked, and I want to reiterate from their perspective. From ours, it doesn't really mean this, but from their perspective, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing these documents, people could just fact-check. Like, the people were still alive who were there. Like, people could just go find out. And in fact, Paul does say that in 1 Corinthians 15. If you don't believe this, just go ask these people. 500 people, many of whom are still alive. Just go ask them. If they were lying, probably not something they would do. They received little to no financial gain for their writing. And in fact, what they received was difficulty and death. This is the biggest evidence that they weren't a bunch of liars. Who dies for something they know to be false? The answer is nobody. Nobody does that. If they're just making this up because they want to, you think about human psychology here. What are the reasons somebody would make up a story? Make it up for fame or for fortune or for influence. But you're about to be burned at the stake. You're about to be crucified. And all you have to do is recant and say, I was lying. Yeah, that's what people are going to do if they're lying. The only reason you would die for it is you genuinely believe. And again, we can think about this from non-Christian sources. Evidence from non-Christian historians Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. He was buried, most likely in a private tomb. His tomb was found empty soon after interment. The disciples believed that they saw the risen Jesus. They were willing to die for this belief. The proclamation of the resurrection took place early, from the very beginning of church history. The point of that is, even secular historians recognize the resurrection is not something they made up later. That was from the very beginning. The earliest gospel message centered on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. They gathered on Sunday for the primary day of worshiping. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic who was converted after he believed he saw the risen Jesus. And Saul of Tarsus became a Christian due to an experience he also believed was an appearance by Jesus. Again, these are all non-Christian sources who are reporting things as they understand them. And time again, what do we find? It backs up what we read in the New Testament. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. If the text we have is what they wrote, we can be very confident of that. If they were eyewitnesses or at least secondhand witnesses to what they wrote, again, the dating of the documents suggests that that's certainly a possibility. And if they were not lying, which again I think is very much the case based on human psychology, there's really only one other alternative. Were they deluded or tricked? For this to be so, there has to be an alternate explanation for the facts. The facts at hand, they claimed he rose from the dead. They definitely believed it. They definitely believed it to the point of dying. A bunch of people converted. And really, as we break down the alternative possibilities, I'll put all these up here at once. The swoon theory. The swoon theory is essentially Jesus didn't really die. He just sort of swooned and passed out, and everybody thought he was dead. And they put him in the tomb, and then lo and behold, he wasn't actually dead. He just sort of got up, and that he was fine. The evidence that we have, both from the biblical account of the crucifixion and non-biblical accounts of how crucifixion went, makes this virtually impossible. Like, the odds that the Romans just got it wrong this one time, when, by the way, if you get it wrong, you as the crucifier, you're going to be crucified. Like, if you get it wrong, you're the one that's put up there the next time. So the odds that they did this wrong, and even, of course, Luke records this, they went and stabbed him to make sure he was dead. Because if the Romans decided to kill you, they made sure you were dead. And so the idea that he just sort of passed out and he was fine, think about the blood loss, and you can, we don't have to go way far into it, but a bunch of medical professionals have investigated the accounts of crucifixion, not just Jesus' crucifixion, but the accounts of Roman crucifixion altogether. They did not mess around. They knew what they were doing. What about mass hallucination? Well, maybe those 500 people, they all had the same hallucination. Well, I guess, that's theoretically possible, but at this point, you're basically basing a thing that's never happened before against another thing that's never happened before. The idea that 500 people are all having the same mass delusion, not even at the same time, because remember, he's appearing to them at one time, and then he appears another time, and then he appears a third time, like 3 different occasions, a bunch of different groups of people. The odds that they all just have this sort of similar mass hallucination is also something medically that we've never seen before. That's something that is not really possible based on what we know of human brain psychology. What about the wrong tomb? They showed up at the wrong tomb, and they all thought it was empty. And actually, by the way, he didn't rise from the dead. But of course, the problem with this is, if that was the case, the authorities could have just gotten the body of Jesus and been like, here he is. Like, they're all proclaiming he's alive. Here's his body. They just were at the wrong tomb. We can go and show it to you and prove it to you. But they never did that. Nobody ever even tried to do that. The Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities, they didn't try to show the real body. The idea that they went to the wrong tomb, that would have been over and done with immediately. The Jews just could have gone like, here he is, right here. And so the last sort of major theory, alternate explanation, is body snatching. That the apostles, who by their own admittance didn't really believe at first, the apostles sort of got together and they figured out how to move the stone, and they figured out how to knock the soldiers out and steal the body. And so we're basically being asked to believe that these people who, by their own admittance, didn't really believe that he rose from the dead, they got this plot together to go steal the body. But that leads us back to the previous problem. If that was the case, why would they die for it? Why would they allow themselves to be subjected to crucifixion and being burned at the stake and being beheaded if they could just say at a moment's notice, actually, that's not true. He didn't rise from the dead. We stole the body. The fact that they were willing to die for this belief is the thing that tells us that they didn't steal the body. But of course, really what it comes down to is this. Many people, most people perhaps, would say that no matter how unlikely, swoon theory, mass hallucination, body snatching, no matter how unlikely, any alternate to the resurrection is more likely than the resurrection. But again, that is not an argument, and this is an important point. That is a philosophical statement. To say any other possibility is more likely than the resurrection is not an argument. It is a statement of your philosophical presuppositions. That you just a priori, that is before any evidence is weighed, you just believe that the supernatural cannot happen. And really that's what it comes down to, the heart of the matter, as we think about are the Gospels reliable? There's only so much we can do in a 30-minute sermon. We haven't even discussed the affirmative evidence, and I know we don't have time to do that. We can think about the radical change in the disciples, the quick spread and adoption of the gospel story throughout the Mediterranean world, the persistence and dominance throughout the last 2,000 years. Like, that's pretty good evidence that it actually is true. We can think about the fulfillment of prophecy, which we've talked about a lot. But if a person is honest with the evidence, what really has to happen is a serious consideration of presuppositions regarding the supernatural, rather than actual historical debate. From a historical perspective, again, this is unget-aroundable. The life and the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus are the most historically attested to event in the history of mankind. From that, especially from that, well, maybe not today, but from that period of time. By orders of magnitude, more well attested. But what it really comes down to is this. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. Ron talked about this, was it this morning? Yeah, in his Lord's Supper talk this morning about the foolishness of the world, or what the world thinks is foolishness. They are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. You either believe that the supernatural is possible or you don't. And if you believe the supernatural is possible, the historical evidence for the resurrection is overwhelming. The only reason you wouldn't believe that it's a real event that happened is you just philosophically don't believe in the supernatural. That the miraculous is just not possible. That is what leads you to the state that Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 2. The natural person cannot accept the things of the Spirit of God because they are spiritually discerned. They require some acceptance of spiritual reality. But for a lot of people, they don't. They don't accept any possibility of spiritual reality at all, which is why the Hebrew writer says this in Hebrews 11:1-3. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By it, the people of old received their commendation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. An understanding of Christianity, belief in the resurrection and in Jesus, begins with faith in God. Faith in any God, really. Do you believe in the spiritual, the supernatural, that there is something beyond this reality? Because if you believe that the miraculous is possible, there is no more well-documented miracle than the resurrection. There is no possible miracle that has more evidence in favor of it than the resurrection of Jesus. But a lot of people will not accept. Not because they're not willing to hear the arguments, but because they just are not spiritually discerning people. And they will not accept anything that is spiritually discerned. That is why the Hebrew writer says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. As we offer the invitation, I know I've gone through a lot of information in 35 minutes. This is a broad overview. We've done sort of the high-level view of these arguments, and I've not gone deep on any of them. I do want to offer the invitation, if you are struggling with doubt, if you're struggling with you're not sure what you believe about the Bible or about the text or about, how certain can we be about these things, please come talk to me. There's a lot more we can talk about. Again, way more than we can fit in a 30-minute sermon. But there are answers. There are answers to be had. And we, of course, understand, I try to stress this a lot when we talk about apologetics. Doubt itself is not necessarily a problem. It can be a problem. But if doubt leads you to find the answers that you're seeking, to have an open, honest heart that is seeking truth, to solidify your faith, to solidify your belief in God, then doubt can be a powerful catalyst for good. It can be a powerful catalyst for deepening our understanding of what God is telling us. Doubt becomes a problem in two ways. It becomes a problem when we isolate. That is, we feel insecure in our doubt and we don't want to be around other Christians because we feel either inferior or we feel less than, and so we're not willing to address it. Doubt can also be a problem when it leads us into, I wouldn't say anger, but resentment about why didn't God make it more clear? God could just snap his fingers and beam it into everybody's minds, and everybody just suddenly believes. And I think a lot of people have resentment because they don't understand why God wouldn't do that. There are, again, reasons for that too. There are answers for why God doesn't do that, really summed up in Hebrews 11, because God is seeking faithful people who will choose to believe in his promises and his word. As we sing the invitation song, Break My Heart, really we're driving at this verse with the song Break My Heart. The stubbornness that we only accept things on our terms, the stubbornness that we only accept things that are easy to understand or things that make sense to our worldly way of thinking, we are asking God to break our heart, to soften our hearts to the truth that he offers, a truth that is fundamentally spiritually discerned. And so if that's your struggle, come while we stand and sing.